Section 1. We promised each other before life got complicated. The silence in our suburban home used to be a comfort, a shared breath between two people who knew exactly where they were going. Now, it feels like a physical barrier, a thick fog that settled in the hallways when I wasn't looking. I remember the early days in that cramped one-bedroom apartment in South Boston, where the radiator hissed like an angry cat and the windows rattled with every passing truck. We had nothing but a shared vision and a collection of mismatched furniture. I worked double shifts at the logistics firm, coming home with grease under my fingernails and a back that felt like it was made of shattered glass, just so Natalie could finish her master's degree without the weight of debt. She used to press her forehead against mine and whisper that we were building an empire, that one day the world would know our names. I believed her because her eyes held a clarity that I lacked, a burning ambition that I mistook for a shared devotion to our life together. As the years passed, the grease under my nails disappeared, replaced by the sterile hum of a mid-level management office. I was the steady hand, the reliable provider who ensured the mortgage was paid and the retirement accounts were funded while she climbed. I watched her transform from a nervous student into a woman who navigated corporate galas with a predatory grace. It started small, a change in her vocabulary, a preference for brands I couldn't pronounce, and a gradual thinning of the stories she shared with me at dinner. I stayed silent because I thought this was what success looked like, the shedding of old skins. I didn't realize that in her mind, I was part of the skin she was preparing to discard. The promise we made wasn't a pact for eternity, it was a launch pad she was finished using. Why did I think a foundation was meant to be seen once the building was finished? I noticed the shift in her phone habits first, the way she would turn the screen down when I walked into the kitchen. It wasn't the frantic behavior of someone having a physical affair, it was the quiet, methodical behavior of someone planning a relocation. She was talking to Melissa Gratt more often, a woman whose own divorce had been a calculated business move rather than an emotional tragedy. I would hear snippets of their conversations from the hallway, words like personal brand, limiting factors, and evolution. I stood there, holding a glass of water, feeling the coldness of the ice seep into my palm. I realized then that I was no longer her partner. I was a legacy system. She was trying to figure out how to decommission without crashing the rest of her life. The humiliation didn't come from a shout or a public scene. It came from the way she began to talk over me in front of our friends. At a dinner party hosted by the Reynolds, she corrected my anecdote about our trip to Maine with a sharp, clinical precision that left me feeling like a child who had forgotten his lines. She didn't look at me with anger. She looked at me with a profound, weary pity. It was the look you give a loyal dog that has grown too old to keep up on the hike. I stayed silent, sipping my wine, watching her charm the room while I became a ghost in my own skin. Was this the cost of the empire we had built together? I began to wonder if the man she married was someone she now considered a clerical error in her biography. One evening, I found a notebook she had left on the nightstand, filled with her handwriting, bold, slanted, and certain. It wasn't a diary, it was a roadmap for a life that didn't feature my name. There were lists of networking events, names of influential people like Adrian, and a section titled Phase 2. There was no mention of us, only me. I felt a hollow ache in my chest, a slow-motion realization that the woman sleeping beside me had already moved out of our marriage in every way that mattered. I stayed silent because the truth was too heavy to speak aloud yet. I stayed because I wanted to see exactly how far she would go to rewrite the history of the man who had carried her to the starting line. If I was a limiting factor, what would happen when she finally broke free of the weight? Section 2. When love starts competing with possibility. The atmosphere in the house shifted from cold to clinical as Natalie's career hit a sudden vertical trajectory. She was no longer just a participant in the corporate world. She was becoming a fixture, a name whispered in the hallways of power where I had no invitation. I watched her meticulously curate a new version of herself, one that spoke in measured tones and never mentioned the years we spent eating 99-cent noodles on the floor of our first apartment. When I tried to bring up those memories, she would smile tightly and change the subject, as if those years were a stain she was trying to bleach out of her memory. It became clear that to her, my presence was a constant reminder of a version of herself she had grown to despise. The version that was needy, uncertain, and reliant on someone else. Adrian Wolfe began to appear in her conversations like a recurring character in a movie I hadn't been cast in. He was everything I wasn't, polished, connected, and existing in a sphere of possibility that didn't require the messy reality of sacrifice or loyalty. Natalie didn't talk about him with passion. She talked about him with a terrifying kind of reverence, the way a climber speaks of a peak they intend to conquer. I sat across from her at our expensive marble island, watching her eyes light up as she described a visionary project they were collaborating on. I realized that she wasn't leaving me for him. She was leaving me for the version of herself she saw reflected in his world. I was the anchor, and she had decided she wanted to drift with the tide. I started to withdraw, not out of spite, but out of a desperate need for self-preservation. I began to spend more time in my small home office, focusing on my own projects that I had neglected for years. I reached out to Henry Lawson, an old mentor who had once told me I had a dangerous amount of patience. We spoke in low tones about market shifts and silent acquisitions, things that felt solid and real compared to the evaporating ghost of my marriage. Natalie barely noticed my absence. She was too busy being noticed by everyone else. She would come home late, smelling of expensive gin and high-stakes ambition, and tell me about her day as if she were giving a briefing to an assistant. Did she even remember my middle name anymore? The psychological pressure was a slow-acting poison that I allowed myself to ingest daily. I would watch her prepare for events, choosing outfits that screamed unattached and ascendant, while I sat in the shadows of our bedroom. She began to treat our shared history like a rough draft that needed aggressive editing. At a charity auction, I overheard her telling Melissa Grant that she felt she had outgrown her environment. She didn't say my name, but she didn't have to. The environment was me. I felt the sting of her words, a sharp, cold humiliation that I kept locked behind a neutral expression. I didn't confront her because I knew that confrontation was exactly what she wanted, a reason to call me unstable or jealous, so she could justify the exit she was already planning. I began to notice the way she looked at our house, not as a home, but as an asset to be liquidated. She talked about downsizing or relocating for the right opportunity, with a casualness that made my blood run cold. Every conversation was a test, a way to see if I would push back or if I would simply fade away as she expected. I chose a third option. I became the most supportive, most invisible version of myself. I ensured her life ran perfectly, handling every detail she deemed beneath her, while quietly building a life raft of my own. I was the ghost in the machine, maintaining the system while the architect prepared to burn the blueprints. I wondered, as I watched her sleep, if she had any idea that the man she was phasing out was the only person who actually knew who she was before the mask became her face. The final straw of the possibility phase came when I found an unsigned lease agreement for a luxury penthouse in the city, dated 3 months in the future. It was in her name only. She hadn't even waited for the marriage to end before she secured her new horizon. I stood in the quiet of our kitchen, the paper trembling slightly in my hand, and I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. The betrayal was no longer a suspicion. It was a documented fact. She was moving toward a future that was shiny, cold, and entirely devoid of my influence. I realized then that my endurance was no longer about saving the marriage. It was about surviving the wreckage. How many more days would I have to play the role of the devoted husband before the curtain finally fell? Section 3. I realized I was being phased out, not replaced. The way she deleted our photos from her social media wasn't an act of anger, it was a rebranding exercise. One Tuesday evening, while she was at a strategy dinner, I scrolled through her profile and watched years of our lives vanish in real time. The hiking trip to the Adirondacks where I carried her pack for 10 miles when she twisted her ankle? Gone. Our 5th anniversary at that little bistro in Quebec? Deleted. In their place were high-contrast shots of glass-walled offices, minimalist coffee cups, and candid photos of her looking thoughtfully into the distance. I wasn't being replaced by another man yet. I was being replaced by a vacuum, a space where a husband used to be, now polished and ready for a more suitable occupant. I realized that night that being hated is easier than being erased. If she were angry, we could fight. If she were hurt, I could offer an apology. But how do you confront someone who is treating you like a piece of outdated software that no longer supports the latest operating system? I sat in the darkness of our living room, the blue light of my phone reflecting in the glass of the window, and I understood the cruelty of her silence. She wasn't waiting for a reason to leave. She was waiting for the right moment to announce she had already gone. I was a ghost haunting a house she had already sold in her mind. The psychological pressure of living with someone who is mentally auditing your value is suffocating. Every time I spoke, I could see her evaluating my words against a checklist of the person she wanted to become. If I mentioned a simple joy like the garden or a book I was reading, she would offer a tight, indulgent smile that felt like a slap. To her, my contentment was a sign of stagnation. She wanted the next level, a phrase she used with terrifying frequency. I stayed silent because I realized that any defense I mounted would only confirm her suspicion that I was a weight around her ankles. Adrian Wolf wasn't just a colleague anymore. He was the architect of her new reality. I began to see his influence in the way she carried herself, the way she tilted her head when she listened, and the cold, transactional way she began to manage our household. He represented a world where loyalty was a liability and ambition was the only currency that mattered. I saw a text from him on her lock screen that simply said, "The transition requires sacrifice, Natalie. Don't look back." I didn't need to see the rest. I knew I was the sacrifice he was talking about, the old skin she needed to shed to join his circle of elite predators. I started to take long walks in the evenings, staying away until I knew she was in bed. I needed the cold air to remind me that I still existed outside of her perception of me. I realized that for years I had defined my success by her happiness, and now that her happiness was tied to my absence, I felt a strange, terrifying freedom. I wasn't just being phased out, I was being released. But the release felt like being pushed out of a moving car on a dark highway. I had to decide if I was going to tuck and roll or let the momentum of her departure shatter me completely. The humiliation reached a new peak when I found her life plan. Document open on her laptop. She had categorized our assets, our friends, and even our shared memories into columns labeled Keep and Discard. My name was at the top of the Discard column, followed by a note, Christopher, Emotional Anchor, Growth Inhibitor. It was written in the same font she used for her quarterly reports. There was no emotion in it, just a cold, logical assessment of a life she no longer wanted to lead. I felt a surge of cold fury, but I didn't close the laptop. I read every word, forcing myself to witness the death of my marriage through the eyes of an accountant. I realized then that she didn't just want a divorce, she wanted a rewrite. She wanted to be the woman who had achieved everything on her own, the self-made titan who had never needed a man like me to pay the bills or dry her tears. She was preparing a narrative where I was a footnote, a mistake of her youth that she had finally corrected. I stayed silent, but I began to move my own pieces on the board. If she wanted a world where I didn't exist, I would give it to her, but on my terms and at a time of my choosing. One night, She came home later than usual, her eyes bright with a manic energy. She didn't even say hello. She just went to the wine fridge and poured a glass of expensive Sancerre. "Big things are happening, Chris," she said, her back to me. "I need you to understand that things are going to change very quickly now." I looked at her, really looked at her, and realized I didn't recognize the woman standing in my kitchen. She looked like a predator that had finally found its rhythm. "I know," I said quietly. She paused, the glass halfway to her lips, and for a split second I saw a flicker of the old Natalie. Then the mask slid back into place, colder and more impenetrable than before. I spent the rest of the night in my office looking at the files Henry Lawson had sent me. While Natalie was busy curating her future, I was quietly securing mine. I had spent years being the foundation, and now I was going to use that foundation to build something she couldn't even imagine. The silence in the house was no longer heavy. It was a tactical advantage. I was no longer a victim of her transition. I was the silent observer of her descent into a lonely, glittering void. The only question left was how long she would keep up the charade before she handed me the papers she had already signed. The section ended with a quiet realization. I found a small velvet box in the back of her jewelry drawer while looking for my cufflinks. It wasn't a gift for me. It was a pair of cufflinks with the initials AWs engraved on them. She was already buying gifts for the life she hadn't yet started, using the money from the joint account I had worked so hard to fill. I closed the drawer silently, my heart a cold stone in my chest. She wasn't just leaving, she was already gone, and I was just the last person to be told. Section 4. Ambition makes emotional casualties. Success has a specific smell. It's sterile, expensive, and completely devoid of sentimentality. As Natalie's star rose, our home began to smell like that, a mixture of high-end cleaning products and the ozone of constant, frantic activity. She had been promoted to senior vice president, a role that seemed to strip away the last vestiges of the woman I had married. At the celebration party, held in a rooftop lounge that overlooked the city she felt she now owned, I was a ghost at the feast. I stood in a corner, watching her navigate the room with Adrian at her side, her laughter a practiced, melodic sound that never reached her eyes. I was introduced to her new colleagues as Chris, my husband, but the way she said it sounded like she was introducing a piece of antique furniture she hadn't quite decided where to put yet. They looked at me with a polite, fleeting interest before turning back to her, drawn by the gravity of her newfound power. I realized then that in this world I was a zero. I had no titles they cared about, no connections they could exploit. I was the emotional casualty of her ambition, a body left on the battlefield as she charged toward a horizon I was never meant to see. The pressure inside our marriage became a constant, low-frequency hum. We no longer had conversations, we had exchanges of information. "I'll be late. The car needs service. We have a gala on Friday." I watched her transform into a machine, her every movement calculated for maximum impact and minimum vulnerability. She began to view my presence as a chore, a social obligation she had to fulfill before she could return to her real life. I stayed silent, observing the way she manipulated people, the way she used her beauty and her intellect like weapons. I wondered if she ever looked in the mirror and saw the wreckage she was leaving behind in her own heart. Melissa Grant came over one afternoon while Natalie was out, supposedly to drop off some files. We sat in the kitchen, and she looked at me with a mixture of pity and calculation. "You know, Chris," she said, her voice soft but sharp, "some people are built for the climb, and some are built for the base camp. There's no shame in being the base camp." I realized then that Natalie had been talking to her, using her as a sounding board for the narrative she was constructing. I was the base camp, the stationary point she had to leave behind to reach the summit. I didn't argue. I just smiled and offered her more tea, realizing that the more they underestimated me, the more room I had to move. The psychological dominance she practiced was subtle but devastating. She would leave brochures for luxury bachelor apartments on the coffee table by accident. She would talk about the importance of individual growth paths during dinner. She was trying to gaslight me into thinking that the end of our marriage was my idea, or at least a mutual realization. She didn't want the guilt of being the one who broke the promise. She wanted to be the one who evolved beyond it. It was a masterpiece of emotional manipulation, a slow-motion exit designed to leave her reputation unsullied and her conscience clear. I began to see the true cost of her ambition in the small things. She stopped calling her mother. She forgot the birthdays of our oldest friends. She became a person who only valued people for what they could do for her in the next 6 months. I saw the hollowness of her new world, the way everyone in it was looking over their shoulders, waiting for the moment they, too, would become base camp for someone else. I felt a profound sense of sadness for her, even as I felt the sting of her betrayal. She was trading a lifetime of loyalty for a decade of status, and she didn't even realize it was a bad bargain. The atmosphere in the house reached a breaking point during a quiet Sunday morning. We were sitting in the sunroom, and she was scrolling through her emails, her face a mask of corporate intensity. I asked her if she remembered the time we got lost in the rain in Florence. She didn't even look up. "Chris, I'm trying to close a $10 million deal. I don't have time for nostalgia right now." The word nostalgia sounded like a slur coming out of her mouth. I realized then that our entire history was just baggage to her, something that made her move slower. I stood up, walked to my office, and finally called the number Henry Lawson had given me. The quiet power shift began that day. While Natalie was focused on her Phase 2, I was initiating my own. I wasn't looking for revenge. I was looking for equity. I had invested 15 years into her career, her confidence, and our life. I wasn't going to let her walk away with the dividends while I was left with the debt. I began to document everything. The shared accounts she was siphoning from, the business secrets she discussed openly at home, and the subtle ways she was violating the very corporate ethics she claimed to uphold. I wasn't a growth inhibitor. I was the auditor she never saw coming. I watched her prepare for a business trip to London with Adrian Wolfe. She was radiant, energized by the prospect of a new frontier. She didn't even pretend it was a solo trip anymore. "Adrian and I need to be on the ground for this," she said, her eyes already across the Atlantic. I nodded, my expression neutral, and helped her carry her bags to the car. As she drove away, she didn't look back in the rearview mirror. She was already gone. I stood in the driveway, the silence of the neighborhood settling around me like a shroud, and I felt a strange, cold peace. The casualty had survived the wound, and now the recovery could begin. That night, I sat in her empty office and looked at the framed photo on her desk. It was a picture of her standing in front of her new company's headquarters. I wasn't in the photo. No one from her old life was. She had achieved the pure version of herself she had always wanted. But as I looked at her polished, professional smile, I noticed something she hadn't. In the reflection of the glass behind her, there was a man standing in the shadows, watching her. It wasn't me. It was someone else, another, visionary, waiting for his turn to climb. I realized then that in her world, the only thing more dangerous than being left behind is being the one currently on top. Section 5. I stayed while she prepared to leave. The house had become a gallery of things that no longer belonged to us, a collection of curated artifacts for a life Natalie was already living in her mind. I stayed in that house, walking through the rooms like a caretaker of a museum, watching her pack away the remnants of our 15 years together into neat, labeled boxes. She didn't call them moving boxes. She called them organizational transitions. I realized that her entire vocabulary had become a shield, a way to sanitize the messy reality of abandoning a husband who had been her only constant. I stayed silent because I wanted her to feel the full weight of her decision without the distraction of a fight. Every time she looked at me, she expected anger, but I gave her only a terrifying, polite helpfulness. Was I making it too easy for her to leave, or was I making it impossible for her to justify her guilt? I began to spend my mornings with Henry Lawson in a nondescript office building downtown, far from the glittering glass towers where Natalie and Adrian Wolfe spent their days. Henry was a man who understood the value of the long game, a veteran of corporate wars who had learned that the loudest person in the room is rarely the one with the most leverage. We worked on a project that Natalie would have considered small-scale, but I saw the underlying architecture of a disruption that would change the local market entirely. While she was busy chasing the approval of people like Adrian, I was building a reality that didn't require anyone's permission to exist. I stayed while she prepared to leave because I needed the time to ensure that when she finally stepped out of my life, I wouldn't just survive. I would be the one holding the keys to the future she thought she was securing for herself. The psychological pressure in our home was a silent, suffocating presence that Natalie tried to fill with noise. She started hosting small, intimate gatherings for her new circle, events where I was expected to play the role of the supportive, slightly invisible spouse. I watched her navigate these rooms, her eyes constantly scanning for the next person who could elevate her status, while I stood by the drinks table and observed the cracks in her new foundation. I realized that these people didn't actually like her. They liked the momentum she represented. I stayed silent when Melissa Gratt made a snide remark about my simple career, knowing that the simple work I was doing with Henry was already beginning to erode the very market share Natalie's firm relied on. How long could she maintain a facade built on the shifting sands of corporate vanity? I noticed the way Natalie began to treat our shared history as a series of unfortunate delays. During one of her gatherings, she told a story about our early years, but she framed it as a period of necessary hardship that she had overcome through sheer force of will, conveniently omitting the double shifts I worked to keep her in school. I felt the sting of her erasure, a cold, sharp realization that she was no longer just leaving me. She was rewriting me out of her own success. I didn't correct her. I just caught Claire Reynolds' eye from across the room, and in her look of profound discomfort, I saw that I wasn't the only one who noticed the cruelty of Natalie's new narrative. I stayed because the truth doesn't need to shout to be heard. It only needs to wait for the lies to exhaust themselves. The power shift was invisible to her, hidden behind the mundane details of my daily routine. While she was finalizing her lease on the luxury penthouse and coordinating her rebranding with Adrian, I was quietly moving our joint investments into a structured trust that she had signed off on months ago, thinking it was just a routine tax strategy. I understood then that the greatest power isn't in stopping someone from leaving, but in ensuring you are standing on solid ground when they finally let go of the rope. I watched her pack her designer shoes and her high-end electronics, and I felt a strange sense of mourning, not for the woman she was becoming, but for the man I used to be, the one who would have done anything to make her stay. That man was gone now, replaced by someone who knew the exact value of silence. Natalie's departure wasn't a single event. It was a series of small, calculated withdrawals. She took the good crystal first, then the art we bought on our honeymoon, then the very air out of the room. I stayed in the master bedroom, which now felt like a hotel suite after a checkout, and watched her stand in the doorway with her coat on. She looked at me with a mixture of pity and a strange, lingering fear, as if she were waiting for me to finally break and beg her to reconsider. I didn't. I just asked her if she had remembered her passport. "You're being so cold about this, Chris," she said, her voice trembling with a frustration she couldn't name. I realized she wanted a scene to justify her betrayal, but I refused to give her the closure of a conflict. I stayed silent because my words no longer had a home in her world. I spent the first night alone in the house, sitting in the dark, listening to the hum of the refrigerator. The silence was no longer a burden, it was a clean slate. I had stayed while she prepared to leave because I needed to see the end of the story she was writing before I could start my own. I looked at the files on my desk, the ones Henry had delivered that afternoon, and I saw that the first phase of our project had been funded. While Natalie was celebrating her new life in her glass tower with Adrian, I was becoming the silent partner in a firm that would soon be her biggest competitor. I realized that she had left me for a version of herself that was built on a lie, and the cost of that lie was about to become very expensive. The week after she moved out, I received a letter from her lawyer, a formal request for a clean break settlement. It was cold, clinical, and entirely focused on preserving her assets while offering me a pittance for the years of support I had provided. I didn't feel anger. I felt a profound sense of clarity. She really believed that I was the weak link in her chain, the growth inhibitor she had documented in her files. I called Henry and told him it was time to move to phase 2. I stayed in the background for so long that she had forgotten I was the one who built the background in the first place. Was she prepared for the moment when the background finally stepped into the light? I realized that the psychological dominance she thought she held over me was an illusion she had created to protect herself. By treating me as a stationary object, she had failed to notice that I was moving in a different direction entirely. I stayed in the ruins of our marriage just long enough to ensure that when I finally walked away, there would be nothing left for her to return to. I looked at the empty spaces on the walls where our photos used to be and felt a surge of quiet, restrained energy. The timing was everything, and the clock was finally ticking in my favor. I didn't need to seek revenge. I only needed to let her ambition lead her to the edge of the cliff she had spent years climbing. The final realization of that period came when I saw a news clipping about Natalie's firm being investigated for aggressive accounting practices. Adrian Wolf's name was prominently mentioned, but Natalie's was right beside it. I stayed silent, folding the paper neatly and placing it in the trash. She had chosen a future of high-stakes possibility, and now she was going to have to live with the consequences of the company she kept. I stood by the window and watched the sun set over the suburbs, knowing that the stability she had abandoned was the only thing that could have saved her from the storm she was about to face. I had outlasted her departure, and now I would outlast her success. Section 6. Success arrives. After the apology would have mattered. The transition from the ghost of a husband to a quiet titan of industry happened in the margins of the city's awareness. While Natalie was navigating the fallout of her firm's internal scandals and Adrian Wolf's increasingly erratic leadership, my partnership with Henry Lawson began to bear fruit that was impossible to ignore. We didn't launch with a gala or a press release. We launched with a series of tactical acquisitions that consolidated the very logistics and supply chain networks Natalie's clients depended on. I realized that my years of mid-level experience had given me a granular understanding of the world that her visionary altitude completely missed. Success didn't feel like a roar. It felt like the steady, rhythmic pulse of a machine that was finally running at full capacity. I stayed in the shadows until the momentum was irreversible, knowing that the best kind of power is the kind that doesn't need to explain itself. Natalie reached out to me for the first time in 6 months on a rainy Tuesday. Her voice over the phone sounded thinner, the practiced corporate vibrato replaced by a frantic, jagged edge. She didn't ask how I was. She asked if I had heard about the unfortunate misunderstandings at her firm. I sat in my new office, surrounded by the quiet hum of a business that was entirely mine, and felt a wave of cold indifference wash over me. She was looking for the man who used to be her anchor, the one who would have stayed up all night helping her draft a defense or a damage control plan. I stayed silent for a long moment, letting the sound of the rain fill the gap between us. "I'm sure you'll handle it with your usual competence, Natalie," I said, my voice as neutral as a dial tone. The apology she was fishing for, the one she thought she deserved for the stress she was under, would have mattered a year ago, but now it was just noise. The psychological pressure had shifted entirely. I was no longer the one being audited for my value. She was the one whose value was being questioned by the very world she had sacrificed everything to join. I began to hear rumors that Adrian Wolf was looking for a scapegoat, and Natalie's name was at the top of his list. I realized then that her future was a house of cards, and she was starting to feel the wind. I didn't feel a sense of triumph. I felt a quiet, restrained satisfaction that I had been right about the cost of her ambition. She had traded loyalty for a seat at a table where everyone was looking for a way to push someone else off. I stayed focused on my own growth, knowing that my success was the only response her betrayal required. Why did she think she could build an empire on the ruins of the person who helped her find the land in the first place? I ran into Claire Reynolds at a local gallery opening, an event that the old Natalie would have killed to be seen at, but which she was now too controversial to attend. Claire looked at me with a new kind of respect, a recognition of the shift in my status that I hadn't even bothered to announce. "I heard about the new firm, Chris," she said, her voice low and sincere. "Everyone is talking about how you managed to pull that off without making a sound." I realized then that my silence hadn't just been a defense mechanism, it had become my brand. I was the man who outlasted the noise, the one who was still standing when the visionary started to stumble. I stayed for a single drink, playing the role of the dignified, successful professional, and I felt the weight of the humiliation she had put me through finally lift and dissipate into the air. Success arrived in the form of a buyout offer from a national competitor, one that would make Henry and me more than just comfortable. It would make us influential. I looked at the numbers on the screen and realized that the amount was almost exactly what Natalie had predicted her. Phase 2 would be worth in 5 years. I had achieved in 18 months what she had thought would take a lifetime of betrayal. I stayed silent because the numbers spoke for themselves. I thought about the velvet box with the AW cufflinks and the lease agreement for the penthouse, and I felt a profound sense of closure. She had left me for a version of herself that didn't exist, while I had stayed and built a version of myself that she couldn't ignore. The apology she finally sent via email, a long, rambling message about regrets and timing, went unread in my inbox for 3 days. I finally met Natalie for coffee at a neutral spot near the park. She looked tired, the expensive makeup unable to hide the shadows under her eyes. She spent the first 20 minutes talking about the unfairness of the industry and how Adrian had misled her. I watched her, not as a husband, but as a competitor, and I saw a woman who was still trying to edit her story to make herself the victim. "I'm sorry, Chris," she finally said, the words sounding like they had been rehearsed in front of a mirror. I didn't realize what I was throwing away. I realized then that she wasn't apologizing for hurting me, she was apologizing for being wrong about who was the winner in our divorce. I stayed silent, letting the sorry hang in the air like a ghost, until she finally looked away. The apology didn't matter because the man who needed it no longer existed. The internal monologue that used to be filled with doubt was now a steady, calm narrative of competence. I understood that my endurance had been my greatest asset, a silent strength that she had mistaken for weakness. She asked me if there was a place for her at my new firm, her voice dropping to a desperate conspiratorial whisper. "We were such a good team once," she said, reaching for my hand across the table. I pulled my hand back, not with anger, but with a deliberate, clinical precision. "That was a long time ago, Natalie," I said, "and the team you're thinking of was built on a foundation you decided was a limiting factor." I stayed for the check, paid it in full, and walked out into the bright afternoon sun without looking back. The consequences of her choices continued to unfold naturally, without any intervention from me. Her firm went through a restructuring that left her with a title but no actual power, a legacy, position that was a polite way of showing her the door. Adrian Wolf moved on to a new project in another city, leaving her to deal with the legal fallout of their shared ambitions. I realized that I didn't need to take revenge because life has a way of balancing the books for people who treat loyalty like a transaction. I stayed in my lane, building my business and my life, and I felt a sense of peace that no corporate title could ever provide. Success was the quiet satisfaction of knowing that I had outlasted the storm she had created, and that I was the one who was still moving forward. I stood on the balcony of my new home, overlooking the city, and thought about the woman who had thought she was outgrowing me. She had wanted a life of high-contrast brilliance, but she had ended up with a gray, uncertain reality. I had wanted a life of shared growth, but I had ended up with a solitary, powerful success. I realized that timing decides everything, and my timing had been perfect. I stayed silent because there was nothing left to say. The moral closure I felt wasn't from her downfall, but from my own ascent. I was no longer the man who was being phased out. I was the man who had redefined the game entirely. The final cliffhanger of this section came when I received a call from a recruiter representing one of the largest firms in the country. They were looking for a new CEO, and they wanted to know if I was interested in taking over the very company that had just absorbed Natalie's firm. I realized that I was about to become the person who decided her professional fate. I stayed silent for a moment, the weight of the irony settling over me like a warm coat. "I'll take the meeting," I said, and as I hung up the phone, I realized that the story wasn't over yet. The quiet power shift was about to become very, very public. Section 7. She recognized the stability she abandoned. Walking into the headquarters of Vanguard Holdings felt like stepping into the future Natalie had always described, but with one critical difference. I was the one invited to lead it. The lobby was a cathedral of glass and brushed steel, a monument to the kind of ascendant life she had traded our marriage to obtain. I wore a suit that cost more than our first car, but its weight felt lighter than the silence I had carried for years. As I was escorted toward the executive floor, I realized that the psychological pressure I once felt in her presence had vanished. It had been replaced by a cold, crystalline clarity. I wasn't here to haunt her. I was here because I had become the very person she tried to pretend I could never be. I stayed silent in the elevator, watching the floor numbers climb, knowing that with every second, I was rising further above the version of myself she had discarded. The boardroom was a theater of high-stakes tension, filled with men and women who spoke in the dialect of acquisition and leverage. I saw Natalie sitting at the far end of the table, her posture rigid, her face a mask of professional composure that was beginning to crack at the edges. She didn't recognize me at first. I was just another candidate, another visionary, being vetted for the throne. But then I spoke. I laid out a strategy for the restructuring of her division, a plan that was surgical, efficient, and entirely devoid of the sentimentality she used to accuse me of. I watched the realization dawn on her face like a slow-motion car crash. Her eyes widened, her hand went to her throat, and for a moment, the predatory grace she had cultivated disappeared entirely. She was no longer the architect. She was just a spectator in a room where I held the floor. I stayed silent during the interrogation from the board, answering their questions with a precision that made her previous Phase 2 documents look like child's play. I realized that the stability I had provided for 15 years wasn't a weakness. It was the training ground for the endurance I was now displaying. Natalie's eyes never left mine, but they weren't filled with the pity she used to show me. They were filled with a profound, terrifying recognition. She saw the man who had paid for her degrees, the man who had sat in the shadows of her galas, and the man who had quietly built a competitive empire while she was busy erasing him. I stayed focused on the chairman, Henry Lawson's old associate, and I felt the power shift move from invisible to undeniable. The silence in the room wasn't heavy, it was a vacuum, and I was the only one with enough air to breathe. During the mid-afternoon break, I found her standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the city she had tried so hard to conquer. She didn't turn around when I approached, but I could see her reflection in the glass. "You did this on purpose," she whispered, her voice a jagged ghost of its former self. I realized she still thought the world revolved around her ambition, that my success was merely a reaction to her betrayal. "I didn't do this for you, Natalie," I said quietly. "I did this despite you." I stayed there for a moment, letting the silence settle between us like a physical barrier. She looked at me, and I saw the moment she recognized the stability she had abandoned. She had traded a solid foundation for a glittering facade, and now the facade was being dismantled by the man who used to be her rock. The psychological pressure was now entirely on her shoulders. She tried to find the words to bridge the gap, to invoke the "we" that she had spent years deleting. "Chris, if you take this position, we can fix everything. We can be the power couple we always talked about." I stayed silent because the desperation in her voice was a louder confession than any apology. She wasn't looking for a husband, she was looking for a life raft. I realized that her entire evolution had been a flight from the fear of being ordinary, and now she was facing the reality of being obsolete. The man she had outgrown was now the only person who could save her career, and the irony was a weight she wasn't built to carry. I didn't feel joy in her struggle. I felt a weary, distant understanding of how much she had truly lost. I stayed for the final session of the board meeting, watching as they discussed the redundancies in her department. Every time her name came up, they looked to me for a reaction. I gave them nothing but professional neutrality. I realized that my restraint was the ultimate form of dominance. I didn't need to fire her or humiliate her. I just needed to exist in a space she could no longer control. The board members leaned in when I spoke, drawn to the quiet authority I had earned through years of patient observation. I stayed because I wanted her to see what a growth inhibitor actually looked like when he was finished growing. The cliffhanger wasn't whether I would take the job, but what I would do with the woman who had once been my entire world once I held her future in my hands. Natalie tried to follow me to the elevator after the meeting was adjourned, her steps hurried and uneven. "Please, Chris, just talk to me for a minute, not as a CEO candidate, but as you." I stopped and looked at her, and for the first time in years, I saw her clearly. She was a woman who had mistaken motion for progress and status for value. I stayed silent until the elevator doors opened, the chime sounding like a bell marking the end of a round. "I am talking to you as me, Natalie," I said. "The problem is you don't recognize me because I'm not standing behind you anymore." I stepped into the elevator and watched the doors close on the version of my life that I had finally, fully outlived. The night was cold and clear as I walked to my car. I realized that the humiliation she had put me through was the fire that had tempered the steel I was now using to build my future. I stayed in the driver's seat for a long time, looking at the building I might soon lead, and I felt a surge of quiet, restrained satisfaction. I wasn't the man who had been left behind. I was the man who had stayed while she fled, only to find that I had reached the destination before her. The timing of our lives had diverged so completely that there was no longer a path back to each other. I stayed silent because the story I was writing now didn't need a co-author, especially not one who would try to delete the first chapter. I thought about the list she had made, the discard column where my name had lived. I realized that by discarding me, she had discarded the only person who would have stayed with her when the visionaries, like Adrian inevitably disappeared. I stayed in the present, focusing on the tactical reality of the days to come, and I felt a profound sense of moral clarity. She had wanted a future without me, and now she had it. The only thing she hadn't accounted for was a future where I didn't need her to be the sun in my sky. The cliffhanger was no longer about her survival. It was about the new world I was about to create, one where her name would finally become the footnote she had tried to make mine. As I drove home, I realized that the most dangerous thing you can do to someone is to underestimate their capacity for silence. Natalie had assumed my silence was a sign of defeat, a slow fade into the background. She hadn't realized that I was using that silence to listen, to learn, and to build a reality that was immune to her manipulation. I stayed on the highway, the lights of the city blurring into a steady stream of possibility, and I felt a sense of peace that was absolute. The stability she had abandoned was now the very thing that would define the rest of my life, and she would have to watch from the sidelines as I built the empire we had once promised each other, alone. Section 8. What love looks like when timing decides everything. The final decision from the board came on a Thursday morning, the same day the news broke that Adrian was being indicted for securities fraud. I sat in my office and watched the story unfold on the screen, a digital obituary for the world Natalie had tried so hard to belong to. I realized that the future she had left me for was never real. It was a mirage built on the vanity of men who didn't know the difference between value and price. I stayed silent when my phone rang with her name on the caller ID for the 10th time that hour. I didn't need to answer to know what she wanted. She was standing in the ruins of her ambition, looking for the man who had always been her shelter. But the shelter was closed, and the man inside had moved on to a different climate entirely. I accepted the role of CEO, not for the title, but for the closure it provided. On my first day, I had to sign the final restructuring orders for the division Natalie worked in. I realized that I held her entire career in the tip of my pen. I stayed silent as I reviewed the documents, seeing the mediocre performance reviews and the dwindling impact she had on the firm. I didn't fire her. That would have been too loud, too much like the revenge she expected. Instead, I did something far more devastating. I did nothing. I left her in her current role, a mid-level position with no path for advancement, under a manager who didn't care about her history or her vision. I stayed focused on the broader health of the company, treating her as just another entry in a vast organizational chart. The psychological dominance was now complete because it was no longer personal. She was a ghost in the hallways of my company, a woman who had to walk past my portrait every morning to get to a desk that no longer mattered. I realized that the ultimate victory isn't in destroying your enemies. It's in becoming their superior to the point where they are irrelevant. I stayed in my office, leading with a calm, restrained authority that earned the respect of the entire firm. Natalie became a cautionary tale whispered in the break room, the woman who had bet everything on the wrong man and the wrong future. I didn't need to say a word to justify my success. The contrast between our lives was the only statement I needed to make. Love, I realized, looks very different when you are looking at it through the lens of time. I had loved a version of Natalie that didn't exist anymore, a woman who was a partner and a friend. She had loved a version of me that she thought she could use as a ladder. When the ladder became a bridge she didn't want to cross, she burned it. I stayed on the other side and built a city. I realized that our timing had been a tragedy of mismatched growth. I had grown deep while she had grown fast. I stayed silent when I saw her in the cafeteria one afternoon, looking older and smaller than I remembered. She tried to catch my eye, to find a spark of the old devotion, but all she found was the polite, distant gaze of a man who was satisfied with his own company. The final meeting we had was in my office, a formal exit interview when she finally decided to resign. She couldn't handle the silence of my presence any longer. She sat across from my desk, the same desk where I had signed the papers that secured my future. "You really are happy, aren't you?" she asked, her voice devoid of its usual polish. I stayed silent for a moment, looking at the photos on my wall, none of which featured her. "I am at peace, Natalie," I said. "There's a difference." I realized that she was still looking for an emotional reaction, a sign that she still had the power to hurt me. I didn't give it to her. I stayed centered in the reality I had built, a reality where her opinion was no longer a metric of my worth. She stood up to leave, her hand on the door handle. "I thought I was outgrowing you," she said, her back to me, "but I think I just got lost." I realized that this was the closest I would ever get to a real apology, a confession of the fear that had driven her betrayal. I didn't offer her comfort or a place to stay. I stayed silent because the time for those things had passed years ago. Timing decided everything, and the time for our life together had run out while she was busy looking for something better. I watched her walk out of my office and out of my life, her silhouette disappearing into the bright, clinical light of the hallway. I felt a surge of quiet, restrained finality. The debt was paid and the books were closed. The moral victory I felt wasn't from her failure, but from my own integrity. I had stayed true to the man I was, even when it cost me everything, and that consistency had become the foundation of my success. I realized that competence and patience are the only weapons you need in a world of noise and ambition. I stayed in my office until long after the sun had set, watching the city lights flicker to life. I felt a sense of profound, quiet satisfaction. I had outlasted her betrayal, outgrown her ambition, and outlived the pain of her departure. The story of our marriage was over, but the story of my life was just beginning its most powerful chapter. What love looks like now is a quiet evening in a home that I built for myself, a place where the silence is a choice rather than a burden. I realized that the empire Natalie and I had talked about wasn't a corporate title or a luxury penthouse. It was the ability to stand in your own truth without needing anyone else to validate it. I stayed silent because there was no one left to convince. I had reached the summit, and the view was breathtakingly clear. I looked at the city below and felt a sense of gratitude for the journey, even the parts that had broken me. Those breaks had been the points where the light finally got in, and now I was glowing with a strength that could never be taken away. The final closure came when I donated the last of our shared items to a local charity. I realized that I didn't want the artifacts of a life that was built on a misunderstanding. I stayed in the present, focusing on the people who actually valued the stability and loyalty I offered. Henry Lawson and I sat on the deck of his house, drinking expensive scotch and talking about the future, a real future, one built on trust and shared success. I realized that I was no longer a ghost or an anchor. I was the captain of my own ship, and the sea was calm. I stayed silent as we watched the stars, a final, peaceful acknowledgement that the storm was over and the survivor was home. I sat at my desk one last time before heading home for the weekend. I pulled out the old notebook I had found years ago, the one where Natalie had written her Phase 2. I realized that I was now living the life she had dreamed of, but without the coldness and the betrayal she thought were required to get there. I stayed silent as I shredded the pages, watching the words disappear into the machine. I wasn't erasing her, I was simply finishing the job she had started. The timing was perfect. I was the one who had outlasted the story, and as I walked out of the building and into the cool night air, I realized that for the first time in my life, I didn't care what happened next. I was already exactly where I was meant to be. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe.